Hey everyone, it's Scott from certainmedia.com, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to build a About Us page using the block editor. I'll also be going over some of the things that you should include in your About page and some of the things that you should probably leave out. Alright guys, so to build your your About page, we need to find a good foundation. Personally, I think the Moz.com About page is a fairly good example. The About page is supposed to communicate who you are, how you got started, and where you're going. The About Us page on the Moz.com site is a very good indication of what yours should kind of look like. It's not overly complicated. If you're a videography business, for instance, you may include your videos instead of various images to showcase maybe your work and how you've progressed as an artist. But for most small businesses, it's just a collection of images, and I feel like this does a very good job of indicating what it should kind of look like. We will be building a basic content About Us page like we did with the Contact Us page using only the block editor. I'll show you the two ways to do it. You'll be able to do one way using the native block editor, which means you will not need any additional plugins. The other way will be using the Genesis Pro plugin. You can also get similar functionality by installing the Atomic Blocks plugin, which is free and in the WordPress.org repository. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new page, and we're just going to call it About Us. You can call it whatever you really wish. Some people like to call it About Us, some people like to call it About, some people like to call it Our Story. It depends on how you're branding your business. If you're trying to make it sound more personable, Our Story just sounds more friendly to the average user, and that's something to keep in mind. The Genesis settings, you have access to a couple of options that I'm going to tick. Your theme will probably not have these options. Notably, I'm going to hide the title. The reason I'll be hiding the title is because we'll be creating one using the cover block, which allows you to have a background image. This typically just looks more professional, and it's also just more stylish in most use cases. It's also a good replacement if you've ever been using slider plugins, particularly if you're commonly using Rev Slider or Revolution Slider. That's a very slow and bulky slider plugin, and I highly recommend you drop it and just use a static image with some text over it. The cover block does that beautifully. One other setting I'll be doing is setting my layout to full width. The reason I'm doing this is because I do not want the sidebar to show on the About page. Your own theme may have a different means of doing that, but for the Genesis themes, this should be under the layout settings. I am an avid user of the Genesis framework, and if you haven't decided on a theme yet and you're wanting to go the Gutenberg route, I do recommend checking them out. So to start, to get that cover photo that I was talking about, click on the block icon and search for cover. So the cover block is a background image with a overlay. It's basically just a color to make the text more visible, and then it has text on top of it. This makes it perfect for having a header block or a header image that illustrates what page they're on. I have one image that I've uploaded. Actually, I have two images that I've uploaded. So I'm just going to use this one. You can use whatever image suits your brand. If you're a construction company, maybe you have some images from on-site, or you've just paid for some stock photos. Whichever way you go, you can't really go wrong. So when you first add the cover block, you'll notice that it's confined to a certain width of the actual page. To resolve this, we have two options. If you click on the outside of the block, so click outside where it says this right section here for the paragraph, and then you'll get a highlight. You can change your alignment. For this, we're going to want to set it to full width. That way it fully stretches to the entire width of the page. That way it acts more like a true cover header. Otherwise, what can happen is if you use wide width, while it will be longer, it will not fill up the entire width of the page. So it's not a true cover photo then. Wide width does have its purposes though, particularly in blog posts if you want to highlight an image but you don't want it to be full width. I find it pretty useful. But for most content, I find the full width option to be the best. So when you first install the cover block, it'll automatically add a paragraph block within it. But since we're going to be adding a header text, we're actually going to convert this using the transform option and switching it to a header. So now that we have it swapped to a header, depending on how your theme is laid out, and it may be a little bit difficult to determine, you're either going to set this to heading 2 or heading 1. Whichever one you set it to, remember, because any of the subheadings that we'll be adding later, you're just going to subtract 1 from it. So if you set this to heading 1, and you can do this by clicking on the cog over here, and you can set the level icon here. You'll just subtract 1 from it from the subheader. So if you're using a text-based logo, so like on my website, it's Cert Media, and I have it actually in text as opposed to using an image, that would be my header 1. So then I would set this as a heading 2, and then subtext after this will be heading 3. Since most of you are probably using a heading 1 in your logo area for your site name, I'm going to set it to heading 2, which is default, but it's just something to keep in mind. So now over here, this is where you're going to actually add your first header. So they have the Mo's story. You can call this something as the Cert Media story, the Bob's Plumbing history. You could call it pretty much anything that sounds in line with your brand. You could even just call it an About Us, or you can call it like Who We Are. If you're using who as a more personable means of marketing to your customers, it would be a very compelling way to structure your headings if you use who. So who we are, how to reach us, things like that. For this website, I'll put who we are because I feel like that's a good roundabout header for most websites. Obviously, depending on how you're branding your website, you'll set it to something else. But I like to use the standard case, so I capitalize the first letter of every word. Some individuals do not like doing that. One thing I want to note too is that under here we change the alignment to center. If we don't, it's going to look very odd because the header will be all the way over to the left side of the screen and it's going to be full width. It would basically be like in this frame of this video where my tripod is in the background. That would be where your text is aligned, and over here is more about where your actual text will be. Under here, we will now, you can use the enter key and this will now create a new paragraph block, and you can tell by just starting to type. And when you do that, you'll now get the options here to align the text center. I think adding subtext in this case makes perfect sense. For instance, they have, we know it's SEO. In fact, we wrote the blog on it. That's a very good thing that it's kind of like a tagline. It just says what they are in a very simple way. So if I was to write one, say for Cert Media, I would say, we know website performance. We wrote the book on it, even though I didn't really write a book on it. The point is, you're writing the text that describes what you do and what made you the authority on it. So Mo's, they did in fact write basically the original blog post on SEO when they first got started. Mo's has been around forever. So that's a very good way of summing up their business. For this fictional business, since I haven't really assigned what it is, I'm just going to copy this text so that there's something there for you guys to look at. But you're going to want to put something there that makes sense for your own business. Just a quick one-liner that says, this is what we do, and this is why we're good at it. Something along the lines. We're going to go ahead and click the preview now just so you can kind of see how it looks on the front end, because I feel like that's something that gets lost in a lot of these tutorials. And it looks fine. The heading text may look a little small to you. That's typically set by your theme. Currently in Core, there is no way to modify the heading text size. So for the paragraph text, you can do that relatively easily. If you click on paragraph, you have text settings and you can set a custom height. There's no way to do that in Core for the heading tag, which is honestly quite silly. Keep in mind, we are running on WordPress 5.4, so this will probably change down the line, but this is the latest stable version. So we get ahead and we have a nice header set up. Now we need to add the alternating text. They have a sub header here where they basically write like a short paragraph that says who they are. Primarily the about page is not so much for SEO value because most people aren't going to search for your business of who you are, but you can use text on your about page to communicate why they should use you and what made you an authority and why you're trusted. And Mo's does a very good job at that. They use a lot of text. They use very nice images. They obviously aren't stock photo, which is very important. For instance, you could tell this one isn't stock photo because it's a picture of Moses' robot thingy and a Lego figure of it, and it's got their branding on it. Using actual images from your business and maybe even your staff or yourself if you're the founder can really add value to communicate to your site visitors of who you are and really like what your work life is like. And that's very good because it allows the customer to understand who you are without even hiring you. And that kind of bridges the gap between when the customer hires you, you may go out to do a job physically, and learning who you are. So they have a little bit of information about who you are before they actually meet you, and that's something that's a bit important. You can do a couple of things for this about page. You can choose to add a paragraph here, and I'll show you how to do that real quick. Some people do not like adding sub paragraphs, and it's honestly personal preference here. You can go into doing the alternating images, which is probably the most common layout I personally see on most websites, is they just use the alternating image format that Moz has here, where it's left image, right image, left image, right image, and it goes down. And that's fine. If you want to add this text though, all you have to do is either get your, come over here and you'll have this section here for your paragraph. I'm going to copy their text in there. You can put your own text here and that's totally fine. One thing I'm going to show you though is we're going to go ahead and click preview. Depending on your theme, as you can see, this text is now run right up against the cover block. There is no native core way as of yet, and you're gonna notice that's gonna be a common trend for Gutenberg at the moment, is this text is run up right against there because there's no way to add a margin in this block. However, there is a spacer element that we're going to make use of. So what you're gonna do is if you added text, just go ahead and hit the enter key one more time so that way it moves it down one level. And we're going to click here on the plus button and you're going to find spacer. The spacer element is basically just a transparent block that really just covers a certain amount of space. It's going to basically just provide the fill-in for what would be padding. I think just adding padding or margin to containers would be much better, but a spacer element is simple enough to where anybody could, in theory, work with it. So you get to set the height in pixels. Keep in mind that the gray that you're seeing on the preview is actually not going to show up on the front end. This is just to illustrate how large X amount of pixels is. So 25 pixels, it's going to look something like that. That does add enough space, and that looks fine to me. If you want to make this center aligned, you can, just like what Moz had. And if you do that, it's going to look something like this, and it looks fine. So now we're going to go ahead and show you how to do the alternating images. This is the section where using atomic blocks will actually come in handy, and you're going to see why. And it ultimately comes down to a limitation in the core columns block. So I'm going to set up 2 columns blocks for you right now. And I'm going to do the exact same steps twice. The reason I'm doing this is to show you what the difference will be between using atomic blocks and the core blocks. So first of all, you're just going to click over here. If you're using core, just search for columns. It'll be the first option underneath layout elements. And you're going to go ahead and set a 2-column split. Immediately after, I'm going to be doing an advanced column, which should be provided by atomic blocks, as you can see here. And I'm going to set it to 2 as well. Now, on the surface, they look basically the same, which is exactly what we want. I'm actually going to be setting up exactly the same format, and I'm just going to be showing you what modifications you can make. So one thing that's important is we want to make sure we get that image over here on the left-hand side, just like what Moz kind of had. And you're going to select whatever image you had. If you're using Jetpack, you can insert an image from Pexels if you need stock photo. But I'm just going to say that if this is your about page, this is probably the one place on your site you don't want to be using stock photos, kind of like on your team member page. You want to actually communicate who your business is and who you are, as opposed to using a random image. So I'm going to be selecting it from the media library. I have a standard stock photo I already uploaded because this business is fake and doesn't exist. And I didn't really want to come up and stage some shots. And I imported this actually from Pexels. Funny enough, even though I told you not to do that, just for the sake of demonstration. I will be copying this image too, just so that I can put it in this columns block below, because it's going to be important to showing you guys why you should use atomic blocks. Okay, so we have the image over here. Now we're going to add the text. So on Moz, for instance, they have our founding is where they start their explanation. And that's basically where you're going to start. You're going to want to say where your business began, how you started to grow, where you are now, and where you plan to go. That almost rhymed. Maybe I should be a poet. No, I'm just kidding. But really, you need to start off where you began if you're explaining your story to your potential customer. The important bit here is this header. Remember back when I said in the beginning that when you use a header up here, you need to use 1 minus the header level up here. So this was a heading 2. That means we're going to be adding a header element here, but it's going to be a heading 3 because this is going to be the child of that upper level. And I'm just going to call it our founding. Again, you can use whatever text you want in this space. I'm just doing it because this business doesn't exist and I just need text to go there. Now I'm going to duplicate this again because, as I mentioned, I want to show you what's going to happen with atomic blocks that makes it so useful. You can now also add a paragraph of text to explain the story. Because this business doesn't exist, I'm going to copy their text. You're going to add your own text there though. And there we go. Okay, so now we're at the point where we have our image, our header, and at least one thing of text. This is where we're gonna have to talk about layout. So we're gonna go ahead and click the preview button because we've added it, and you're going to notice basically they're gonna look identical at first. So our founding and the text is rammed right up against it, and it looks absolutely terrible. So what you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna extend the width of the column section. Kind of like what we did on the cover photo, how we could do wide width and full width. You can do the exact same thing with the core columns block. If you need to access this, basically find the white space between the two columns and click it. And now you can set wide width or full width. Wide width, again, will stretch it, but it won't be 100% the width of the page. And for some users, this is all they need. Some users, though, tend to want their content to be full width or to be just slightly larger. If you set it to full width, though, using the core block, you're going to run into one obvious issue. There is no part margin really on the left and right hand side. So now the image is huge and it looks silly almost. Now with atomic blocks, you're able to do one very useful bit of information. First of all, I can set it to be full width, which is what we're going to do. But what you can also do is set the column interior max width or inner max width. Basically, while the whole column block will stretch to the size in the container, which is important if you want to use a background color, which I'll show you here in a minute. You can also use a background image, but I wouldn't recommend doing that unless you're only using text. The reason this is important though is because you can still have a background color that fills the entire width of the page, but it's not going to stretch the content of it because now we can set the interior max width of the content to be 1200 pixels. So now what happens is we're now at 1200 pixels. And I'm gonna show you real quick what kind of happens. The wide width here is kind of around 1200 pixels and they look very similar, but now you're gonna notice the one ultimate flaw. If you wanna set a background color, and most people like using some sort of alternating background color, whether it's just even an off gray, they wanna add like that stripe effect where the content is broken up even though it's basically the same thing but in a different side for the image. You can set a color. You can set the background color and a text color. Keep in mind that these default colors here are set by your theme. Some themes may not set them at all, but it's no big deal. You can use a custom color, and I'm going to set the background color, the text color to be white, and I'm just gonna find a really ugly pink that I can set there. So the text color is now white, and the background color, ooh, I kind of like that. All right, no idea what color this is, but you're also not getting any warnings right now because somehow this is very friendly. Actually, it kind of looks like Yoast SEO's color. And so we're gonna go ahead and preview it. So keep in mind, this was the core block, and now here's the weakness. Because we're using wide width, our background color will not stretch to the entire width, which means that it's just highlighting this part. But with atomic blocks, it will, because we set an interior max width, but we told the column that it could be 100% width. So what you're gonna do now is if you wanna use atomic blocks, go to the color. And with atomic blocks, you can use margin and padding as well. Same thing with Genesis Pro, but using the interior max width is just easier for you to maintain, and it's easier to maintain on smaller devices as well. So we're gonna do the exact same thing. We're gonna set our background color here. One thing that's slightly annoying is that it's actually the opposite direction as it is from core. And now we've gone ahead and we set this to be white. And now this is where it becomes quite painfully obvious where the core blocks lack. Right now we have basically the ideal setup. One thing you'll note is that the text here has no default padding, whereas my theme adds a default padding to the columns block. If you want to add that with this real quick, we can do that. Padding is the easiest way to think of padding and margin is padding is the interior of the element. So basically the space between this image and the top of the pink here, margin is outside the element. So it would be the outside of this container. So we're gonna be modifying the padding, and I'm just gonna set maybe like a 15 pixel top padding, a 15 pixel bottom padding. That may not look good, but I just wanted to have something in there to illustrate how the padding works. Okay, looks a bit better though, don't you think? Now, you basically are going to copy this similar effect, but from each point afterwards. So now you would basically add another section, and you would add the image to the right-hand side and the text on the left-hand side, and you're going to alternate that basically until you tell your story. And that's a pretty good, simple layout. This doesn't rely on any slider and virtually no JavaScript. And depending on your theme, it'll probably look better than this standard Genesis sample theme that has very minimal styling. And the last bit that you may want to know is this quote here. So if you want to add a quote, there's a couple of ways that you can kind of do this in core. I'm going to delete the core block just because I don't need a duplicate block and it's kind of ugly. But, you know, they'll always improve core blocks before a plugin updates theirs. So here is the deal. When you want to add a quote, you have a couple of options to do this. Core actually has a couple of really good options. So you have a quote and then you have a pull quote. So if you use a pull quote, the easiest way to do this is you basically have a quote that you're copying. I'm going to copy this because I'm really lazy and I don't want to have to find an actual quote online. And it has some basic styling. With the pull quote blocks, you can go ahead and give it a solid color, which will have a background color, and it will have a white text. This is good if you're trying to make the quote stand out from the rest of the content. Or you can go ahead and just do the defaults, which is white with a black text. You can also, of course, as always, set a background color here, which is the main color, and then you can set the text color. And we're just gonna say that Scott Hartley wrote this. I did not write this, obviously. We're gonna go ahead and preview what this kind of looks like. Using a quote can be useful if you're trying to give like a message from your CEO or your founder. So one thing that you'll notice is that at least with the default styling from Genesis Sample, this is very large and quite overwhelming to the user. And we can modify this a little bit because once again, we have access to wide width and full width. So if you set this to wide width, it will look a bit better. You can go ahead and set it to wide width. And remember in core for this block, there is no way by default to add an image next to your text, and there is no way to modify the text size. This should be set by your theme. Genesis Sample, for some reason, wants to set it to like monstrously large, as you can see. My Genesis Sample theme sets it to 32 pixels, which is monstrously large. Your theme will probably set it to something smaller, probably conservative around 26 pixels or so. You can't set the text size though, which again, is a little bit of a weakness of the default core blocks, but you do get a good quote here. If you wanted to, you could probably have somebody work in an image here. I wouldn't really think about adding one because you've already shown who you are. And while they added their image here to show that it's coming from like his mouth, it isn't really a one-to-one. There's not really a good reason to show your image again because this is your about page. You've already communicated who you are at one point. I'm imagining on your about page, you've included a link to your founder or CEO at least once to show who they are. So long as they're actually interfacing with that individual in your business. And it's fine. You can add a header if you wanted to add this, but a quote is just kind of a good way to round off the page. And you can choose whatever colors align with your brand, and you can do the alternating effect. And the best part is you've used no JavaScript, so you'll have an incredibly fast website. You're using virtually no CSS. It's not a lot, and it's already loaded with default core, and your website will load faster for it. All right. And that was how to build an About Us page only using the block editor. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments below. If you want to talk about some of your own design choices too, please feel free to comment. I'd love to check them out. Otherwise, make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.